Hi, this is the podcast of OFFNews, one of the few free media in Bulgaria. I'm Искра Ангелова, and my special guest today it's an honor to present to you Arua Дейман, who is the CNN war correspondent for so many years and who's been a main speaker for this conference of Association of European Journalists and America for Bulgaria in Bulgaria today in Sofia. We'll tell more about Arua in our conversation because her life is like a novel and a very, very adventurous one and like a roller coaster at the same time. And she's a very brave and daring journalist. But what I want to start is with the topic of the conference, which is who is telling the story today?
I mean, it's a really hard question. At the same time, I think in some ways it begs the follow-on question of which story is being told and who is actually also telling which story, which goes to the heart of what the conference is all about. Who is telling the story? Who is sharing history today? And I think in many ways, with the opening of social media and all these different avenues that we have of information sharing, a lot of us are telling a story. But then the question becomes, who is telling the story?
The real story.
And does the story mean what it did today to most people as it did, for example, 20, 30 years ago?
And that's very important because in your speech, in your talk, you were mentioning, let's stop trying to pretend we're neutral. Then another speaker mentioned that they meaning the evil forces, I mean the people who don't want free media, free thinkers, critical thinkers to be out there, are using this neutral alibi to actually silence us, you know? So... which is nobody's neutral.
We are not built to be neutral. And then you also need to look at what does, neutrality imply. It implies that you don't have an opinion, you don't have emotion. All of us have opinion and emotion. And I'll quote, one of my former colleagues, CNN's Christiane Amanpour, when she said, our job is not to be neutral, our job is to be fair.
Right.
And that means fair to the story. That doesn't necessarily mean being fair to any number of different sides that exist in a story. It means being fair to the story, what it is that you're seeing in front of you. So we, for example, if we look at any footage of the aftermath of any bombing, we know what the story is. We know that, for example, an apartment building has been bombed. We know that children are being pulled out from underneath the rubble covered in dust. That is the core of the story. We know that civilians are suffering, for example, in that context. The thing that we still haven't quite figured out how to address with all of these different sort of information avenues that exist is what then happens with that information that we know.
How we analyze it.
Exactly.
And that's the job of the journalist, right?
Exactly. But I think what is also missing in the way that journalists operate, but in the way that analysts operate, in the way that those of us that are meant to look at and dissect and educate people, is an understanding of emotional history and the way that our individual emotional history and our emotional trajectories play into our thinking, but also that of our parents and our grandparents, because we're not born these wiped hard drives. We're not born blank slates. We carry a lot with us. And we need to get to a point where we can appreciate what someone who we perceive as being on the other side of a conflict is also carrying with them, because that's defining the way that they're thinking. Mm-hmm. And unless we start to understand each other's emotional histories, unless we start to understand the way we're thinking, even if we don't agree with the thinking, we need to understand it. Right. And we need to understand it so that we can just stop with these cycles of violence and polarization and complete disaster that we're finding ourselves in.
Yeah, because we don't live unfortunately, in a fairy tale where there is defined good and defined bad, right? Is that what you're saying?
Very much so. I mean, we like to think of things being very neatly split into this is good and this is bad. But nothing is split into that. Nothing is that clean. We are these incredibly messy, complicated creatures, and yet we fail to appreciate our own complexities. We want to somehow simplify our existence into, I'm good, they're bad. It's black, it's white. But unless we understand the 50, million shades of, we say shades of gray now, it's got like a completely different context, but unless we understand all of the different, levels that exist between those two extremes, we're never going to understand each other. And if we don't understand each other, we either need to accept that the world is going to be on a train crash collision into, self-destruction to a certain degree, or at the very least, the destruction of morals and principles that we want to live by, or we do begin to open ourselves up to understanding.
But let's not mislead our viewers with this, because I totally agree with you. But then there is a civilizational choice which every one of us has to make every day. So we cannot compromise with that. Meaning to understand the opposite opinion doesn't mean to be a conformist, right?
No, of course not. And I think this is part of the propaganda machine.
Exactly.
The propaganda machines are trying to put forward these messages of, if you begin to understand, or if you begin to even be empathetic with the opposite side, with the enemy, it somehow means as if you are in agreement of what it is that they're doing, or that you somehow support their perspective. I can understand, and I could not—
without support.
I can understand the thinking behind an ISIS fighter who has decided to cold-bloodedly slice off another human being's head. I can understand that thinking. I can understand how that person got to be that way.
How?
In this particular
Context.
example, it's someone who I was interviewing when I was reporting out of Iraq, who had been detained, and he had, grown up in a small area. The Americans had come through. His family had been killed. He had joined one fighting group and then another, and the cycle of death and violence kept continuing. And then he kept seeing, his neighbors, his relatives humiliated in all of these multiple, operations that were happening, and the way that they were being arbitrarily detained. It was first the Americans, and then it was Nouri al-Maliki's predominantly Shia-led government. But it all came from these feelings of
anger,
oppression, feeling as if your dignity has been taken away from you. And then all of a sudden, here comes this group that says, we have the biggest guns and we can restore what you believe is going to be, your rightful place. We can give you a solution to the way that you're feeling. And there's a lot of propaganda with it, obviously, a huge propaganda machine when it comes to an entity like ISIS. And then something inside this young man's head snapped, because that's not the way he was raised. But something inside his head snapped, and he became a believer. So, of course, I don't agree with what he did, but because I understand how he got to that point, you can
talk to him.
I can talk to him, but also I can look back and say, if at the time, and this is what, U.S. military generals are doing and did a little bit at the time, you look back and you say, actually, the way to, in quotations, win the war is not to actually fight per se, but to look at the causes that drive somebody to pick up a gun. And if you don't address the causes of why that person is picking up a gun, you might kill them, but you're not going to kill the person who's coming next if those causes aren't addressed.
And how do we address this when it comes to this war, which actually opened here a huge gap? It divided our society. I'm talking about now the war, the Putin's war in Ukraine. Huge gap in our society, because we're a post-communist society, because all the traumas we have, because all the closeness we do have feel towards Russia and so on and so on, because of the huge propaganda, were very well paid and organized. Not like our position is our true position, our media's position. They are organized, well paid, and they're funding parties, nationalists, and so on and so forth. Everything. When we come to this war, is it going to end? why it has started. And we were talking with you about Ukrainian dignity and stoicism, you said. How long are we going? The whole world is going to quietly wait and rely on Ukrainian stoicism and dignity. Actually, Ukrainians are fighting for our civilizational choice.
I mean, I wish I had a crystal ball. And the thing is, when you look at kind of the Ukrainian battle space, there's more than one player. You have the Americans, and they have a big say in which direction this goes in. And obviously, with Trump's rapprochement with Putin, there is a big and very real fear that the Ukrainians are going to get a deal shoved down their throats that is going to result in the loss of some of their territory. And resolution like that is almost going to be more certain to potentially breed the next round of whatever it is to come. What we're seeing happening in Ukraine, and especially the way that the US is acting and reacting to it right now, lends itself to a number of different pathways, right? Like if Europe decides to step up and try to fill in the gap that the Americans are leaving behind, it's an opportunity for Europeans. If Ukraine is left on its own, I mean...
Opportunity for what, though? Here the propaganda says an opportunity for a third world war.
If Europe gets involved?
Mm-hmm.
I mean... It's quite interesting the way that even the Americans and the Europeans up until now were kind of giving Ukraine enough not to lose, but not enough to win, because they don't want to anger Russia to such a degree that Russia actually does something bigger.
Does pull the button there.
Exactly.
Which has always been the stake.
Exactly. And then, you kind of look at the way that, we, all of us, have constructed this world in the way it is today. And I think...
But in this world, America was, although we both know to what extent, and America was this big guy, the good, big democratic society that will stand behind somehow values that we cherish. And now, during the last months, it's not.
I mean, I would argue even before that, America stopped being that. I mean, I would argue for most of my, at least, adult life.
Your father is American, right?
My father is American.
And your mother?
My mother is Syrian.
Is Syrian.
Yeah, so I grew up in this very sort of mixed household of, labneh za'atar, blueberry pancakes. Grew up speaking both Arabic and English.
Then you moved and you lived in Morocco, and you live in Turkey now.
I do, yes. So we moved. I lived in Morocco and Turkey. Then I went back to the U.S. for college.
You were an excellent student.
Oh, God, no.
But of biology.
I mean, I was not a very good student. But yes, I did. I graduated in biology, but I was not necessarily
with honors.
I did, yes. But the thing is, that's where you kind of turn your own story around for yourself. It took me a while to get interested in learning, which is a bit bizarre because now I'm just so thirsty for knowledge. Yeah, but no, my first few years at university weren't great.
Because you were rebellious. Yeah. I can tell.
Yeah. I was. I mean, I was a typical, kid. Yeah.
But then what brought you to journalism?
I think I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. So I graduated with this degree in biology and French. And then I sort of landed in New York City because a bunch of my friends were there. And then I ended up getting this job at this Turkish textile company, which is basically a fancy way of saying I was selling bathrobes and towels, which a lot of people find quite hilarious. And then 9/11 happened. And obviously there was the sort of shock of the day itself. But when I think back on that now, what I really remember is the dehumanization campaign that the U.S. launched almost immediately. And the way that all of a sudden, and this is something I was spared, but my friends who looked more ethnic than I do were being targeted.
You don't, yes.
I don't. I look like your typical American girl next door. I sound like her. And that sort of put this thought into my head of, I'm going to be a journalist and I'm going to go and explain people to each other. Because I also had noticed that when I spoke to my American counterparts and friends, they would listen to me. Because all of a sudden, even though I could be saying exactly the same thing that somebody else was, because I said it.
Because of the color of the skin, basically.
100%. The color of the skin, the color of the hair, the eyes, the accent,
Right.
all of it. They would actually listen.
Right.
And so why not put that to use? And then the other part is, especially as the U.S. was gearing up to go to war in Iraq, it was like, well, how does one side of you end up calling the other side of you less than? How does one part of you end up otherizing another part of you? How do both parts of you end up going to war? And I was staunchly against the war. And so, yeah, that's why I decided I was going to go.
And you went freelancing.
Yes, but not as like,
Baghdad.
It wasn't as like
No,
G.I. Jane as that. But yeah, my first job was as a freelancer.
But you were so devoted to this idea then.
Yeah. And my parents were very supportive.
Were they?
Yes. Well, yes, they were supportive of me doing a career change and to me
But was
pursuing
it
journalism.
dangerous? I mean,
Yes. I don't think they were especially thrilled with.
Why? Well, I want to
actually, my mom disowned me for the first 4 months. She wouldn't pick up my phone calls.
You see?
Yeah, I know.
Mommy, I want to become a war journalist. Bye.
No, absolutely not. My mom actually said, I wish upon you to have a daughter just like you, and then you'll understand me. And I basically said, well, I'm not having kids, so.
By then, you knew that you don't want to have kids.
I think I always knew, yeah. Yeah, which everyone finds really strange because obviously I have this charity that
Exactly.
treats children, and so it doesn't.
I saw you on screen how you do take care of kids.
Yeah.
Motherly.
Yeah, I just.
Let's talk a little bit about this. So you entered journalism because you wanted to change the world, like
Yes.
we all did.
Yes, naive and idealistic and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
And then you realized that it's not possible, and you decided to actually change it.
Yeah, so
with another tool.
Yes, it was about 2012. So I had already, by that point, done almost a decade, mostly in Iraq. And then Syria had kicked off. And Syria was very different to anything because that's kind of when we started to see the social media activism really begin to emerge. We used to call Syria the YouTube revolution.
Huh.
This was, before Instagram and everything
Right.
that's happening right now. And so all these young activists that we all made contact with were all going out there, getting this footage, risking their lives, trying to bring it back to us. We could very rarely access Syria. And when we did, it was just for brief periods of time. And it was this roller coaster of crazy emotions. And so by 2012, I was in this horrible, dark space of, it doesn't matter. No matter how many people who are dying, no matter how many of these young, brave activists went out and tried to get the videos or went out and tried to demonstrate, it doesn't matter. Like we're watching this crazy train of Syria going towards the worst case scenario, because even back then we could see the radicalization that was emerging everywhere. And so I was in this, I always say, like, I kind of felt as if I was on the edge of an abyss and I was holding on by my fingernails, but they were starting to break and I was just holding on. And then out of that kind of darkness came this idea to start a charity, because throughout all these years, you always come across kids who've been injured, and sometimes you can do a story on them and they get help, but sometimes you do the story and they don't get help, or you can't do the story on all of them. So why not create a charity that can help these kids who have basically fallen through the gaps get access to medical and mental health care?
That's so great.
And in many ways that helped me enormously, because all of the sort of the anger and the darkness and the unprocessed emotion, instead of boiling inside me because I wasn't good at processing, I could turn that into action and do something tangible.
Absolutely. I admire you for this, because we're just talking. We see injustice, we talk about it, we might do a piece on it, we do whatever we can, but then we don't actually help the people involved in it, and you did, and you do. So how can we get involved and help your kids in your through your charity foundation?
Oh, so it's called INARA.
INARA.
Yes, which is the International Network for Aid, Relief, and Assistance. But INARA in Arabic means ray of light.
Okay.
And here's another funny side story. So I have INARA tattooed here on my wrist.
Saying?
It says INARA. It says the name of the charity.
What it says.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I tattooed it before I launched the charity, so that if I ever wanted to give up, I would have a constant reminder of how I had failed. But in terms of, how to help, obviously, like, raising awareness. So right now we work in Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Egypt, and Gaza. We're looking towards expanding into Sudan, Yemen, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think one of the most important things that people can do is kind of just go, look at the work that we're doing and see what part of it resonates with you. And, if you can donate, that's amazing. If you want to come out and volunteer, that's amazing. But even if you're just kind of sharing what's happening, because we've built INARA's social media so that it also acts as, obviously through the humanitarian lens, but a tool to be able to help to understand. And I think one of the big challenges that the kids that we treat face is being ostracized from society, right? Like, you look different, you're given a different label no matter where it is that you are, but actually these are just kids. I mean, yes, their faces are burnt a lot of the times, for example. And I remember a friend of mine saying, how can you deal with spending so much time with kids that have such severe scarring? And that kind of made me think, because I actually don't remember their scars.
You don't see them. You see them as souls, as kids.
Well, that's the things, like, yes, it's a bit, the minute you spend time with them, that's not what stays in your mind. When you
love somebody, when you are able to love, which is part of our conversation on our way in, that we lost our sense of love, empathy, understanding for each other. And it's also part of this huge cataclysm that we're going through, but also social media, that self-exposure, that me all the time. And you, in your talk, actually started talking about journalism, going and doing a professional journalism through empathy, which made the scar, right? I mean, I understand very well what you're talking about. Where and why did we lose our ability to be empathic? And to love, and to not to live in constant fear and danger and anger.
Did we ever have it?
Did we? I think we did.
I don't know. I wonder that a lot. Like, is this something that we lost, or is it something that we actually never, and I'm talking about, like, as collective members of humanity, ever
collective
have?
Subconscious.
Yeah. Like, did like, literally, like, was there an era where we were more, where we actually had genuine empathy for each other?
Well, I think like 15 years, 20 years ago, maybe it was the golden time when
but that was the onset of, Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right.
Nobody cared about how many Afghans were dying, how many Iraqis
That's
were dying. True. Before that, Rwanda, Bosnia, all of these things that we swore we would never let happen again.
But I always blame the media for all this, because maybe I've worked in media all my life. I think not we, but media is very much part of this brainwashing. And it is.
Yeah, and it's also, manipulation.
Exactly.
We need to, and this is going to sound, we need to emotionally evolve, so that we are not so easily manipulated.
How do we do that?
I mean, I think it requires, every individual to do a lot of self-reflection and self-evaluation that, frankly, many people are not capable of right now. But I think, if we sort of continue to hamper our own emotional evolution, if we continue to hamper our inability to understand each other's emotional histories, and if we continue to, refuse to see others as the same as us, we're not going to be able to change anything. We need to develop the skills to be able to recognize when we're being emotionally manipulated. And that can be either, what the military does, which is basically called psychological operations. And it's part of any military strategy that starts well before the first bomb or bullet is ever launched. And that is heavily focused on, dehumanizing the perceived enemy, because no population is going to accept the level of death and destruction that is generated in war unless they somehow believe that those who are suffering from it, the civilians, are less than they are. And in the political space, propaganda, we need to realize when we are being manipulated by propaganda and competing agendas. And then also in, right now, the social media space, where there's all sorts of micro manipulations that are happening. And unless we are willing to accept, first of all, that we are and have been manipulated, and then how do we sort of unpack that and peel away the layers and start to form our own original unique thoughts, we need to grow. If we don't grow and evolve, we've evolved so much technologically, we've evolved so much medically, we've evolved so much in our exploration. We know so much about the world around us right now, although there's still a lot to discover. But we have not emotionally evolved.
Absolutely. That's so true. And what you're talking about, this theory, it's very interesting that our past, not our childhood, but our grandparents' past also matters. That we have these huge traumas that are
and we don't even know
developing as people, as persons, as societies.
So I began to sort of clock into this with myself. Probably roughly 10 years ago. And I went to see and do what's called EMDR. So it's like electromagnetic something, I don't remember. But if an expert's listening to me right now, they're going to hate my explanation of it. But basically, the brain is like any other organ in your body. And the brain can also suffer and need treatment. And obviously, the way a brain sustains an injury is through trauma, or a phrase that is used a lot right now, moral injury, you name it. And after a certain number of traumas, your brain can break. And what EMDR does is it sort of helps your brain realign. It helps you properly reassign the right emotions to the right events.
Oh, sounds scary. Like reprogramming your brain?
It's not so much reprogramming, I would say, as it is soothing. So it's done either through like tapping left, right, as you're talking through a process, or they move a light left, right, or you get these little clappers in your hands. And you're having a conversation with a specialist, with a therapist, who's kind of guiding you through this conversation, but all the time this left, right is happening. And that is meant to help realign your brain. And the way that it was described to me, and I was working with this phenomenal person, his name was ironically Mark Brain, who was also a former journalist himself. So he fully understood my context. But he was kind of describing it as an emotional release. So you're squeezing it all out, and you're squeezing your bad habits and your ways of negatively processing things out like a tube of toothpaste. So one of the things, the reason why I brought this up is one of the things that him and I landed on going back through, trauma was my mom. So my mother was 3 years old when her father, who was then Syria's prime minister, was assassinated.
Oh, right. I forgot this part. Yes. Your grandfather was a Syrian.
Yeah, so my mom obviously was too young to have any, memory of any of this. But in some ways, and this is what we landed on through all these sessions with Mark, I was still emotionally processing like a 3-year-old child.
Yes.
And so that sort of discovery with him led me to start looking into intergenerational trauma, which led me to land on epigenetics, which is, relatively speaking, in fields of study fairly new, although it's been around for decades. And it's basically about how each generation passes down its trauma.
But can you process them?
So in theory, I mean, you know, you're not necessarily going to directly process the trauma of your great grandparents, but if you are able to do sort of work on yourself, you can mitigate what you're going to pass on to the next generation. And you can mitigate the impact of it on you. So basically, if trauma isn't processed, it becomes what they call calcified. So it becomes very hardened. And if you think of your psyche becomes very hard and rigid like a skeleton. And that can severely impede your capacity to function in society, to be a productive human being, to open up to certain thoughts and different ideas. And this is why it's so important that, you know, mental health be a part of, you know, warscapes and disasterscapes, and that you go in with these programs as soon as possible, because you want to sort of mitigate against the calcification of trauma. Because
what happens to these kids that you're taking care of now in 20 years?
Exactly.
If they keep the trauma.
Because you never get over trauma, right? Like the whole notion of like, oh, healing, you don't heal from these kinds of traumas. You don't heal. What you can do is give someone else, or even give yourself, the tools so that that scarring, that calcification becomes a little bit softer.
But you yourself being to so many wars, witnessing so many horrors, you yourself probably are traumatized by them, right?
I mean, of course, like what kind of a person would I be if I wasn't traumatized?
But how does that work? I mean, how do you keep going? What's your fuel? Because it's obviously not the instinct of self-preservation.
I mean, no,
which you don't have, obviously.
Apparently not.
We don't have that instinct. Sorry, Mom.
Yeah, oops. No, I think I'm a bit of a problem solver, and I don't like being told that something isn't possible. And then I also think I have a huge conscience. And it kind of like, if something doesn't make sense to me, it doesn't make sense to me. So like, it doesn't make sense to me that we live in a world where a child who has been burnt in a fire caused by a bomb is not able to access treatment for that injury. It doesn't make sense to me. And so I instinctively look towards creating a solution. It doesn't make sense to me that, again, another example, you know, a community of people living in, you know, makeshift refugee tents don't have access to clean water because it's too far away from, you know, the normal water route. It doesn't make sense to me. Like, there's a solution for that.
Absolutely.
And I think looking for those solutions, and this was also sort of the logic I had as a journalist, you know, we always figure out as journalists a way to get to the story. Like, even if the permissions are denied, even if we're being told, no, you can't do that.
Yeah,
no,
especially
you can't go
then.
there. We figure out a way. And so for me, it's kind of the same thing of, you know, problem solving as a journalist, and then working now in like both of these spaces, but also this concept of it doesn't make sense. Like, it's wrong and I want to fix it, which is a bit naive.
It's not because you're ambitious, because if you were ambitious, you would have stayed as a senior correspondent at CNN, but you left CNN.
If I was ambitious, I also probably wouldn't have stayed in Iraq as long as I did, because I stayed, and people used to say to me like, you know, the Iraq story's over. Like, you know, you need to move on. You need to go to the next big thing. And like literally CNN had to like pull me kicking and screaming out of the bureau. And it was the same with Syria. Like, I didn't necessarily sort of chart my career path based on what would be, you know, smart moves.
Right.
I just kind of always, I guess in a weird kind of way, I was always sort of led by my heart, which sounds, yeah.
You send the material now, journalistic material, to some outlet. If it's not a secret, what are your...
No, it's not a secret. Actually, so the hard drive has... So I did this documentary. I left CNN to film this documentary that basically tells the story of 4 war survivors, one who's in a wheelchair, from Syria, Ukraine, and Afghanistan, who have come together to go for the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro.
Oh.
And, you know, they're young. They're, you know, 18 to 22 years old. And it kind of follows this crazy week-long adventure and expedition that they're having up the mountain. But at the same time, I did. So I'm obsessed with mountains and nature. Because especially mountains like that and experiences like that will teach you something about yourself. And they always say the mountain has a lesson for all of us, and it's never what we expect. And so they're on this adventure. They're learning things about themselves. They are being pushed to the limits physically and psychologically, and then they're also kind of bonding with each other through their individual shared trauma and overlapping experiences. So it is being screened at a theater in Dubai, and I needed to get it to them.
We want to watch it. My father, who recently was gone, climbed Kilimanjaro.
Oh, really?
Oh, he not alone, but yeah, he did. He was very proud of it. We also have this small mountain here in Cherny Vrh.
Is that the one I saw out the window?
Right.
Yeah.
And then yes, so he was going every week to climb there too.
Yeah, he would have related to it a lot. But it's available to stream actually.
Even in Bulgaria?
It should be on some of the platforms. So if you just go to like seizethesummitfilm.com.
There is this wonderful documentary festival which is done by Ajit Prop. And maybe... Okay, we'll talk about this later. We were talking about how raising you also influences your future choices, and how to drag our kids out from the screens, but not to use, of course they'll use phones and they'll use platforms and they'll use AI and everything, but just to broaden their horizons. And have you found solution to that?
Not yet.
Because, in all those conferences, we're discussing how to get to younger audiences through their means, through their platforms, through TikTok. Is this the way, though? Because it's such a short spin of attention. And
it is. And it goes back to a bit of what we were discussing before is, and this is even before actually sort of the TikTok generation came about. But then you begin looking at how, U.S. networks are doing news, especially those who are very geared towards an American audience. And it's all very short packages. Like I remember when I was starting out, they would be like, oh, can we have 45 seconds on the latest out of Iraq? And I'd be like, what the, so we've been kind of moving towards this trend of, as we call it, bite-sized news. But that's very limiting on a person, especially a child's horizons, unless they have already been previously opened up. And I think this is where educational responsibility comes into play, right? Like, obviously, I consume things on social media. I will, absentmindedly scroll through reels, mostly of cats.
Because you do have cats, right?
I do have cats, yeah.
How many?
3. I know, my little rescue monsters, of course. My mom was like, Arua, why can't you just buy something nice looking? I was like, I know, but now I understand why people love their ugly children. But yeah, so we're so used to this bite-sized consumption. But if your horizons have already been opened up, then bite-sized consumption is not going to risk shrinking them.
Mm-hmm.
In theory, bite-sized consumption should be enough to awaken curiosity so that we then, because now we have the tools, go out and research and look into something. So like say you see something on TikTok or Instagram that grabs you.
But they don't, But
that's the thing, is that's where what happens before they reach the age needs to come into play, right? Education needs to open children's horizons a lot more, especially, and I can only really specifically talk about what happens in the US because my whole family's in education, but kids don't grow up with enough curiosity about the rest of the world.
Right.
If you look at, children here, for example, or, children in Turkey where I live right now, or, in Lebanon where I used to live, they know a lot about the rest of the world. People there naturally know a lot about the rest of the world.
United States is a self-sufficient somehow. When I was working in the news in the United States, I noticed that they don't care about international news in general. They just don't.
And I think that goes to, again, like curiosity wasn't properly awakened. And I remember when I first moved back to the States, so it was for college, And I obviously had friends who were, American from, all over the United States, and they didn't care about international news.
But why you think?
Because their horizons were never open to it properly. So the minute they would meet me and they'd be like, oh, here's this girl, and like, we're friends with her right now. Oh, wait, you lived in Turkey? Oh, your mom's Syrian? And then all of a sudden they're curious about these things. And all of a sudden they would be the ones who would bring me an article, unless we had newspapers back then, but they would be the ones bringing me an article about something because they had grown interested.
But isn't it vice versa again? Isn't it media that portrays only the local news? So that's why people are not used to be, they are genuinely probably curious. I mean, they are.
They are if it gets awakened when you're young enough, I think.
And when you were young enough, what was your favorite book?
The Chronicles of Narnia.
I love it.
The Witch in the Wardrobe.
You too.
Yeah.
I told you my dad was reading it from English because it was forbidden here. Most of the books that you guys had, we didn't. It was such a, because the author is theologist. And but we of course had Alice in Wonderland, Peter. So why the Chronicles of Narnia?
I love the idea of escaping into a fantasy world, and I also love talking animals.
Aha, yes, the talking animals and trees.
I have a secret fantasy where like I have a lot of talking animal friends. Like that would be my dream. I kind of secretly want to be Dr. Dolittle.
Right, also. But we live throughout our lives some sort of an archetypical plot of our favorite books from our childhood. So it's probably telling something about you. For sure it is. And your cats, for sure. And also saving,
it's a strange thought.
Innocent, vulnerable people, too.
Do you ever get that thought of, I'm living in the wrong timeline?
Right. Yes, I do. When do you want to live?
I don't, it's not that I want to live in the past or the future, but it's just this timeline.
Right.
Like what we're living right now, the way that we treat each other.
I know.
What you need to, do or what you're taught to think you need to do to survive, to be successful is kind of so contrary to me that I feel like I'm in the wrong timeline. Like there's another separate timeline where we get it a bit more right. And like maybe that's like what's better suited. It doesn't matter.
Do you see it in the future?
That things are going to get better?
Yes.
No.
So you don't have hope?
No, I don't have hope.
How are you running like this, like crazy like this without hope?
So I get asked that a lot. Do you have hope for the future? And my answer is always, no, I don't. And then it's, how do you keep going without hope? And I realized this fairly recently, actually. I don't need hope. And it was sort of empowering because a lot of the situations that I've dealt with, as you have as well, whether it's as a journalist or as a humanitarian, are so massive. They're so big.
You cannot fight them alone.
It all feels so hopeless. But this is also a strategy. It's a strategy to create things that are so big and so hopeless that we turn away. We become apathetic. It's too much. It's how many times have you heard, oh no, it's too much for me to deal with. I can't think about that right now. And this is a deliberate strategy, whether it's, carried out by militaries or politicians or, whoever it is. And so all of a sudden realizing I don't need hope kind of gave me some of my power back. Hope is not my main motivator. Hope is not what actually keeps me going. And so it almost made, and not almost, it did, it made everything easier.
And what is that keeps you going? Obviously not the nightmares that you probably have from all the wars.
Actually, what's interesting? I don't have nightmares.
I don't have nightmares. You don't?
No, I don't. I am so grateful that I don't have nightmares. The closest thing I'll have to a nightmare, or rather what my nightmares have always been, are some sort of scene that culminates in betrayal. So I don't have nightmares about bombs and bullets and like all the horrible things that I've seen. But I have nightmares about betrayal.
And it's happening more and more. because we lost our values somehow are vanished.
Yeah.
And it's not that this world that's coming now from the part of the United States of America, from Russia, from all the parts in the world where there is war now, it's better morally oriented, right? It's destroying any moral common sense.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a phrase for that. Depraved indifference.
So we do what? Escapism.
Well,
or actually do something like you do.
I mean, yes. I'm also I have this frame of mind of, it's kind of the opposite of assigning blame to everything else. Like, everything is my fault.
Right. Okay.
You know, if things don't work out, it's my fault. It's my fault. Yeah. Like, I have a huge burden of responsibility. If I'm going to talk about X, Y, and Z and I'm going to complain about it, I have a burden of responsibility towards trying to fix it. And I think, again, we've been too...
But that's rather masochistic, though. Too.
Someone said that to me.
It's rebellious.
They were like, "Are you
masochistic?" Because all the fault is on. I understand you very well.
Like, obviously, I'm not responsible for like everything that's wrong in the world, but I do believe that
take responsibility for your own actions and choices.
Exactly. And that we are all too easily conditioned to say, "Oh, but it's that thing's fault," right? So, like, if you're in the Middle East. And I can say this because I am half Arab. Literally, most people will be like, everything is America's fault. Everything is the West's fault.
Right.
And they did blah, blah, blah to us 80 years ago. I understand that. But that was 90 years ago. And at some point in time...
changed.
You need to take responsibility for your actions. There was a huge amount of criticism, for example, as to how Europe reacted to Ukrainians fleeing. They went and they had the buses waiting and the piles of clothing and the offers of warm tea and, do you need a place to stay? And so Middle Easterners, Arabs were saying, well, why didn't they show that same level of empathy and compassion to the Syrians and the Iraqis and the Afghans at the height of the refugee crisis?
Maybe because they weren't visible.
They were visible. And I was saying to them, I was like, listen, fair point, but also, where were you? Where were you?
Because our editor-in-chief had in his house a Ukrainian family. I mean, he acted, not through his media. He just made a choice.
And that's the thing, is like, should Europe have shown the same level of empathy towards, let's face it, brown people fleeing across Europe?
Yeah.
Yes. But at the same time, should Arabs have also stationed themselves at the borders of Syria and Lebanon, or Syria and Jordan, or Syria and Turkey, and asked Syrians when they were fleeing, do you need a place to stay?
Yeah.
Do you want a warm cup of tea? And so there's this tendency to sort of blame everything on stuff that has happened in the past and completely and totally abdicate responsibility. And if all of us collectively abdicate responsibility, then we're in a lot of trouble.
Like here, for example, people say, well, the transition between communism and capitalism actually didn't happen. It was a fake transition. We are not happy with the result. It was all fake. But yes, what did you do? What elections did you, what choices did you make? I mean, where were you people? Like 2 million people just escaped Bulgaria. They just don't live here anymore. As speaking of collective responsibility, we are where we are because of the choices we made. Not we, maybe.
No, but also we.
Also we, yes, unfortunate choices, but I'm not sorry for any step. Are you? If you can go back 10, 20 years ago, would you do something differently?
No, and that's not because I haven't made mistakes, or it's not because I couldn't have done things better. The thing is when I think about where I am right now, and it's like, am I okay with who I am right now? I am okay with that. And if anything in my past had changed, I wouldn't be here today, and I wouldn't be who I am today. And I believe that our biggest giver of lessons is not the success we have. It's actually the mistakes we make and what we learn from them, and how we're able to change and evolve.
That's
and
wise.
Like, I'm not a product of my success. I'm actually a product of the countless times that I literally fell flat on my face. And it's all about how you pick yourself up and where you move on. You know, a lot of people were asking me this question when I left CNN to go do this documentary, Seize the Summit. And they're like, yeah, but it's, you know, it's really scary. Like you have this cushy job and this nice title, and now you're going to go off and like self-fund and produce and direct a documentary where you're going to, you know, 7 countries and climbing a mountain. And I was like, yeah, but I'm more afraid of living with regret than I am of trying something and failing. Because I can learn something from the failure. The regret will eat me alive.
Absolutely. Who said that success is actually to go from failure to failure with a greater amount of enthusiasm? Roosevelt, I think.
Well, it's pretty wise of him.
It is but that's that's a very, 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 very wise way of thinking. So if you can go back 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't change anything. But okay. I'm wondering if your parents would agree with that. Are they happy? Were they happy with your choices? Because it's also part of this generational
I think
type of line.
My mother was just so scared. She was so scared. I remember she messaged me when I was in Syria. And let's face it, you know, it's not like I went to these places and I sat in an office. Like, I threw myself into all of it. And
was your life at stake?
I've had a lot of close calls. Like, I'm a cat with 9 lives, practically. Not to make light of it. And I remember my mom once messaged me and she said, Arua, Syria took my father. I don't want Syria to take my daughter. And I was like in the middle of who knows what going off around me. And
but what is it in you that brought you there? What were you looking for? Justice, truth, adrenaline?
No, it's not. I don't get that adrenaline rush. I do get scared. Marie Colvin said it best. She's absolutely brilliant. She said, courage is not being afraid to be afraid. And I believe like you do need fear in these situations because it's what's going to keep you alive, because you have to respect the danger that you're in. No, I think it's wanting to understand and then wanting others to understand, actually. I have this sort of deep desire for other people to understand. I don't know why I have that, but I do.
If you now go back where you live, obviously now in Istanbul, but you have to tell them what they need to understand about Bulgaria with your short experience from it, what would that be?
It would probably depend on who I'm talking to in Istanbul. Because obviously Turkey right now is very polarized around Erdogan and the ruling party. For my personal close circle, I would tell them that there's a very similar circle in Bulgaria that is also fighting for the same things, and that maybe there's ways to reach across.
Which is freedom, basically.
It's freedom. It's, you know, the concept of, you know, what kind of a democracy do you want your country to have? How do you fight back against polarization? How do you stop and start to address the way that things like refugees become politicized? And, you know, the plight of refugees all of a sudden becomes politicized. You were mentioning it happening to me here to Ukrainians. You know, we saw that happening very clearly to Syrians in Turkey. You know, the sort of erosion of certain norms and principles. I mean, but let's face it, you know, Turkey was never really a free media country. It's always kind of been at the bottom of the list.
Journalists in jail there.
It's been at the bottom of the list of press freedoms. You know, and again, it's kind of like after I travel anywhere, there's so much more that binds us than divides us. And this is kind of like why I wish I could make people understand. You know, when you're out there in the field and these moments happen and it's not necessarily when the camera's rolling. And you just
it's never when the camera is
exactly. And you just think to yourself, like, if I could magic everybody into this moment, they would get it.
Yeah,
and it's always those small human moments that kind of happen on the sidelines. So, you know, I was covering the Iraqi and U.S. offensive against ISIS in Mosul. And the Iraqi unit I was with was ambushed, and we ended up sort of under siege for like a day and a half. But there's this one scene where we go stumbling out of the vehicles and, you know, my cameraman's bleeding. The Iraqi soldiers are bleeding. I was fine. I mean, covered in blood, but not mine. And we stumble into this civilian home's courtyard. And the women and the children are cowering in the back corner, and it's pitch black. So all you can see is the whites of their eyes. And the head of household, you know, comes out saying, "Welcome, welcome," which is just crazy because the gunfire is, you know, going off all over the place. And then the Iraqis are being treated like kind of in his small little courtyard, and they're trying to bandage themselves up. And it's madness. And then he goes off and he cooks us the last of his eggs, all of us. Because that's him holding on to his dignity. And no matter what the reason was that we came tumbling through his front door, we were guests. And you're always hospitable to guests. Yeah. I mean, who does that?
Telling stories. I wish more people like you were telling the stories of the world today. And this was what you said, why keep on going, because otherwise somebody else will write history instead of us, right?
Yeah. And I'm a big believer in, you know, we all kind of get into journalism wanting to create some sort of big dramatic change. And it's a bitter lesson when you realize, especially now in this day and age. But I do believe in the industry. I do believe it's worth fighting for. And I do believe that even if we can't change our current trajectory, we at least need to not allow the victors to be the only ones who are able to document history.
This is a very, very, very appropriate ending of this absolutely gorgeous conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
It's been a
Absolutely
pleasure.
Great. And for coming to Sofia and for opening this conference with this great speech you had. And I think it made a lot of people in the audience think, actually, why did they get into journalism at all? Because we forgot somewhere on the line. And yes, thank you. Thank you very much. This was OFFNews podcast. And see you soon.